to run under Android when Google is being so friendly.
Okay, so can I ask that we think about reconvening? And the folks out in the lobby area, please come in and join us. Again, trying to adhere to our time schedule. Thank you. So our next panel has the title of Corporate Views in the Americas. And that's an intriguing title, I confess. But representing views under corporate views in the Americas are two hugely important companies and two excellent thinkers in those companies. One from Ford Motor Company and one from Intel. And Ellen Hughes Cromwick, the chief economist for Ford, will, I'm sure, if her remarks are in any way going to touch on similar remarks, be very direct, be very honest, and be very straightforward, and be very insightful. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Ellen, and Paul Thomas, chief economist of Intel, he's representing on this panel the local global company. There are fantastic operations here in Arizona and throughout the world. So without more, I'd like to turn this over to Ellen. Are you first? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here and to turn the discussion a little bit from business development to economic growth and the kind of business conditions and consumer conditions that are in play across the Americas. The purpose of my presentation is to kind of focus a little bit on the business cycle and policy dynamics, because there are some important changes that are underway among the emerging markets in the Americas. And that one change that I'd like to highlight is the fact that we're now beginning to see the early stages of more cyclicality among these markets, and how important it is in terms of the economic policies that these emerging markets deploy as they encounter cyclicality. So I'm going to focus a little bit on that, and first just start out with a few key points. You can read this, and as well, this will be posted on the website. First point, I like to start with the end first. A pretty favorable report card, and I think that's good for all of the interested parties in this room. We expect we're poised for moderate growth. That's a throwaway term in economics for, probably trend, probably, in some countries a little bit below what their full potential is, but it's at least growth, and that is a positive, sustainable message. But the second point is equally important, that we should expect a very wide continuum of performance, and I'll bookend that as we go along here. We've got a great anchor in terms of Canada, you can see as my point here, and also our U.S. situation, which I would say, you can see the soundbite here, heals from the financial crisis, i.e. the subtext there is that we're not finished in terms of the aftermath of the financial crisis. We can talk a little bit about that in the Q&A if you'd like. And then, of course, a very strong message around Mexico. A lot of structural barriers to improvements in the standard of living in some of the South American markets. I'll talk a little bit about Argentina and Venezuela. And then also, importantly, Brazil, which faces substantial challenges as they rotate away from hopefully high inflation above the target rate of inflation that the Central Bank of Brazil does, and then the perplexing landscape on the investment and capital spending side. Bottom point, last but not least, there are so many important and precious assets among the Americas: people, trade linkages, and also the natural resource base, just to name a few. And many of you may remember that the U.S. was about to embark on a Western Hemisphere policy prior to 9/11. I was talking with someone about this last night, that, you know, that initiative was truncated by 9/11, but there were a lot of working groups, particularly in the U.S. Treasury Department, as well as in Mexico and some of the other nations, to begin to establish a more cohesive economic integration. That was delayed, postponed, but I think now we're coming to a point where I am hopeful that we will get to that point of a greater effort in terms of Western Hemisphere policy. But I'm not going to speak directly to that point. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context first for the growth here. And what better way to do that than to look at vehicle demand, because vehicle demand is a great proxy for economic potential. When countries achieve the takeoff stage of economic development, which we defined as per capita incomes in the range of $5,000 to $15,000 on a purchasing power parity basis adjusted for inflation, there is a significant increase in the number of households in the middle income bracket, and then a very nice cyclical move up, but also funded by that structural development in terms of purchases of consumer goods. And here you can see the 10-year sales track. I bring this because, you know, what is interesting is that even though global GDP growth last year was lackluster, by our measure, based on market exchange rates, we barely got to 2.2% GDP growth, but there was a strong improvement in vehicle demand, primarily because we have over 50 countries globally that are in that takeoff stage. In terms of the Americas, you can see quite nicely the growth in North and South America since the economic recovery began for most of these countries in 2009. In South America, you see a 1.5 million unit increase in demand during this period, and of course the recovery in North America quite strong, in fact exceeding expectations in Canada as well within that North American line. And then of course the rest of world, which is growing quite strongly, even if we exclude China from those estimates. In terms of the Americas, I'd like to first segue and talk a little bit about the volatility in the emerging markets currencies recently. And, you know, I guess my tagline on this is, you know, expect it. Expect to see this type of volatility. But as one of our earlier speakers noted quite, I think with great insight, is that, you know, not all of these emerging markets are moving with the same triggers. And it turns out that those countries that have the largest sell-offs in terms of their recent currency movements have A, high and sticky inflation that the central bank hasn't pursued in terms of bringing it down to a more reasonable rate in order to ensure sustainable economic growth, or B, political instability. And so some of the key takeaways here, you can see Argentina and Venezuela are really in a chapter of the book unto themselves. They have very large and unstable political and economic structures, and will take, you know, several years for a return to what we would consider more sustainable economic conditions. In the case of Russia, Turkey, and South Africa, you know, larger current account imbalances, some political cocktail there as well in the case of Turkey in particular, with the scandal that is now underway that has embroiled the government. So I think just if you look at what we have seen in terms of the sell-off, one of the points I want to convey here is expect it. Expect to see, you know, this kind of volatility. It is not abnormal, and I wouldn't put all of the trigger to this change in currency values in the lap of quantitative easing reduction, i.e. the QE tapering. That has been one element that global investors assess as they rebalance their portfolios globally, and it has certainly led to a recent reduction in capital, let me put it this way, capital flows into these emerging markets. So we've seen actually some rebalancing out of these, but I don't consider this to be abnormal. In fact, if you look at the volatilities here, which I measure as the coefficient of variation for a 5-year moving average period, you know, we should be expecting double-digit moves in currencies. And the last point I want to make here in terms of the Brazilian real, for many of you who may be close watchers of Brazil, you will remember that it wasn't too long ago that the real had appreciated to about a 155 peak. So we did have the other side of this move, which is the currency appreciation period that, by the way, benefited quite significantly many of the investors in Brazil during that period. They did quite well, even if they hedged partially that currency exposure. Okay, having started with that, let me rotate back to the U.S. and talk a little bit about the assessment of conditions. I'd say that in general, using this 4-panel, you see some recent improvements, both in terms of consumer sentiment, even though the mid-month reading for February was spot on to the January final. You know, that is still, you know, above 80, which should lay the groundwork for improved discretionary spending. At the same time, the PMI has been volatile. That last reading is largely a weather report. And the move, though, above 50, I think is pretty sustainable. Unemployment rate has come down, and the GDP growth rate has accelerated through the second half of the year. Now, that doesn't really tell you what the outlook is. In general, the economy is poised to continue to generate at least 2% GDP growth, but it's not clear that we're going to get a lot of cyclical thrust. And why is that? Even with the unemployment rate coming down, there is still a very weak trend in terms of wage improvements and after-tax real pocketbook income. And the fact that our labor market is still throwing off workers in terms of the participation rate is a constraint for economic growth. So I know a lot of forecasters have gotten a little more bullish. I think quite possible we could see a 2.5% growth rate, and even, you know, something a little stronger than that. But I guess the message I want to leave you with is that, you know, don't get too excited. The fundamentals really have not shifted decisively yet to what we would consider a more a growth rate that's more in line with what the economy's potential is in terms of specifically the supply side accounting, in terms of labor input growth and productivity growth. And here you see the housing assessment with the latest indicators. And, you know, from our housing stock adjustment model, we expect that household formation over the next 10 years should trend in that 1.5 to 1.7 million unit range. Of course, the contribution from multifamily household formation and is likely to be much more robust than single family. But here you see in the top left panel, home building activity improving somewhat, but a little bit of a weather report more recently coming down to 880,000. But underneath that still, similar to autos in the early part of the recovery, there are a lot of supply constraints in terms of permitting and other factors that are holding back the development. And I think that that is an important vestige, so to speak, or aftermath of the financial crisis, that we are still working through a lot of supply side issues that, absent those barriers, we could achieve better growth. In North America, the vehicle sales performance has been quite good. In fact, since 2009, you can see in the top left panel, there has been double-digit growth. And specifically in the U.S. on the top left panel, you can see last year at 15.9 million, total vehicle demand has grown over 50% since the trough in the second quarter of 2009. And by our estimate, nearly all or almost 100% of that growth has been pure replacement demand. And from an auto standpoint, that sort of tells it all in terms of this business cycle or lack of business cycle recovery, because it's just the wear and tear on the vehicles on the road, and they are just simply getting replaced. We don't really and haven't seen any signs of what we would call discretionary spending on new vehicles, which is a typical characteristic of a normal business cycle. Turning for a minute to Mexico, I wanted to note here specifically that we have seen on a level basis since the 1990s an improvement in FDI in the top, you can see that top right panel, year to date, we're running at about $24 billion. And on the bottom left, you can see the source of FDI, of course, the U.S. being very substantial, but also note rest of world is about a third of that FDI. And productivity improvements have been a key driver. And with potentially new structural reforms to be implemented, that productivity growth should help enable the economy to move to a stronger trend growth rate. On Brazil, they have had substantial growth following the financial crisis. You can see in 2012 in the top left panel a very decisive move up in consumer confidence. And during the period before the financial crisis, the economy produced over 30 million new households, according to their income distribution data. And that has helped to support very strong GDP growth. Even prior, on the bottom right panel, prior to 2011, GDP growth was even stronger than 4%. But most recently, you can see on the bottom left panel, a move down in terms of production rates, in fact, shrinking by 2% on a year-over-year basis, and the economy slowing down quite a bit. Now, let me go to the next slide here. In terms of the latest indicators, the encouraging sign now more recently is that inflation has started to come down. It's now within the target band, the 2.5% to 6.5% inflation target band that the Bank of Brazil is pursuing. And that has now happened after a full year inflation rate that's been in the upper end of the target range. The policy interest rate has really hurt the economy, but has been an appropriate policy in the context of that higher inflation. Likely, the central bank will remain anchored on that policy, which I think will help as we get into 2014, end of the year, and into 2015. but it isn't probably a positive story for this year. So I think the economy is still going to have a very tough go of it in 2014. Let me turn for a minute to some of the South America vehicle demand indicators. And as I just said, sorry about that, I can go back here, mentioned the softness in Brazil, but yet you see this very strong tick up in vehicle sales. But part of that is because they had a very attractive sales tax cut that had been in place, and it very well boosted vehicle demand in the period through 2013. Now, in January, there were a lot of orders that were placed in December to take advantage of that tax cut, even though it did expire on Jan 1. So you are seeing some sizable throughput from the sales tax cut. That has now gone away, and we will likely see some softness in vehicle demand for 2014, and is part of the reason why we expect to see, some pretty challenging stats in terms of economic activity this year. Now, note the bottom two slides here. Again, just as a good leading indicator for economic activity, with the deval in Argentina to a rate of 8, even though the market's trading a little bit better than that, around 780, 790. The fact that the government intervened and implemented a deval meant that consumers had less of an incentive to arbitrage and buy additional vehicles to park value. So if you think about, put yourself in the shoes of somebody that's facing 30% inflation. Is a real inflation rate is not what the Argentine government has been publishing, although they've issued a new measure a few weeks ago. Think of, facing prices that are going up 30% a year. You get all your money offshore in non-pesos, and if you can't do that because of capital controls, you buy hard goods and you park the value of your paycheck in something like a vehicle. And that's why you see this very artificial growth in vehicle demand in Argentina in the recent period. That isn't what I would consider genuine demand. That's demand because people are trying to get out of the way of the train of hyperinflation. That all now is going to come out of the economy in the next 12 to 24 months as we lead up to the elections in Argentina. So the significant uncertainty in the fact that every day the government is shoring up how many pesos and dollars are moving in and out through the capital account. The fact that they're down to FX reserves less than $30 billion at this point is a signal of the dire situation that Argentina is facing. So despite the fact that they have had periods of good rudders in terms of economic policy, today is not an example of that. So we're in for a really rough ride and quite unfortunate, from the standpoint of a country that has so many valuable and wonderful natural resources and great human capital as well. That's a negative story. And in Venezuela, I don't need to tell you about the situation in Venezuela. We're watching it very closely. But, point of fact is even this amount of vehicle demand is artificial because companies that produce vehicles in Venezuela are allowing their employees to buy those vehicles. Why? Similar to Argentina, in that they're allowing the employees to have the benefit of parking their paycheck value in a hard good to get out of the way of the drastic gap between the actual exchange rate and the posted exchange rate at 6.29. So again, an example of what not to do in terms of economic policy, and the fact that it's going to be several years to right the course in those two countries, both Argentina and Venezuela. Let me just show you a little snapshot of the kinds of challenges that Argentina is confronting. And you know, I'm not a commodity expert, but I've become very much a student of soybean meal and oil, because that is basically one of the things that they're going to be able to monetize to help pay the bills on a daily basis. And if you've read anything about what's happening in terms of the harvest and the drought in Brazil, you know that they are not going to have the same kind of benefit coming out of this harvest in the next few months. So that's a concern here, especially when you look at the fact that, you know, they're not going to get this kind of revenue that they had gotten at the end of 12, and this likely will come down further as we get through the harvest season. I guess the only other point, I've talked a little bit about the peso problem, and also the fact that the trade situation is, and these trade numbers are also somewhat suspect. I hate to advertise that, but here the fiscal situation, which is off the rails. So a confluence of structural and policy imbalances that do not bode well for the next 3 to 5 years there. And I guess I want to close with a little bit of a, I guess, warning sign. You know, don't think that Brazil is off the hook. They're in a bad neighborhood. And the correlation between industrial output in Argentina and Brazil during this period is 73%. So Argentina and Brazil are joined at the hip. There's a tremendous amount of concern in terms of the Mercosur trade agreement. You know, how viable is that going to be going forward? Does Argentina need loans from Brazil? They've solicited loans from many different entities, and that is going to be, you know, an area that Brazil is going to confront here, along with the fact that Brazil has a lot of competitiveness challenges as well. Not just that they're linked to Argentina, but they have their own share of structural issues that they've got, at some point, they have got to address. The Brazil cost layer is a real factor in terms of harvesting the great benefits that Brazil could offer in a Western Hemisphere enlightened environment. Okay, I'm going to finish up here. And again, a lot of these, all these slides will be on the website. Got a couple of other points, and I think I've already raised this, but look at this situation here, where the Brazilian real now has moved up from 220 to 330 against the peso. They basically have just become very uncompetitive in Argentina as this cross exchange rate has accelerated. I have a couple of points around the risk pricing. You can see the credit default swaps for Argentina have blown out now to a very almost, you know, at a price that for which nobody is willing to buy that insurance product, and even well above some of the peripherals in Europe. And I am going to, I've got a couple points here on the policy dynamics. I think I've hit all those. I want to close with the U.S. economy in a so-so growth track, 2.5% to 3%, Mexico likely on trend at 3 to 4%. I think somebody mentioned a 5% growth rate for Mexico. I think at some point that could be possible, but there have to be some sizable adjustments on the structural front to get to a 5% growth rate and the productivity growth that implies. And you can see my points there on Argentina and Brazil. And without further ado, let me take this time to introduce my colleague here from Intel, Paul Thomas. Paul?
Okay, am I mic'd? I guess I am. I'm going to work without a net and without a suit. I didn't realize when I left my suit hanging in a peg at home it was so I'd be eligible to apply for a job in Arizona, but now I know. What I'm going to do is, I didn't really follow my brief, sorry. I'm going to show you sort of what's going on in the IT industry, the information technology industry. It's now usually called ICT, Information Communication Technology Industry, because it's not just about PCs anymore, that's for sure. And I'll show you some of the things that are happening, and I'll say a few comments. We can pick the rest up if you like in Q&A about how the Americas fit into the story, but it's been a fairly uniform story around the world. And I'll sort of walk you through that. Well, first of all, disclaimer, don't believe anything I say. And I'm going to talk about some big issues. The press and the people who are writing an awful lot of books about both the economy and about the ICT industry and how it's changing our lives, it's inevitable that people will try to make the connections between those two big factors. And I'm going to talk to you about some statements that people make that seem they're inherently self-contradictory, some of them. So I actually don't know where the equilibrium is going to be, but a lot of the trends and speculations I'll talk about, they can't all be true because they contradict each other. So let's just sort of dive right in. So one is, there's been a lot of attention to the question of whether or not the disappointing post-recession growth in the United States, the way that Europe sort of fell into their own recession after the US was already officially in recovery, and the constant on-again, off-again challenges in Japan. Whether this meant that the so-called advanced economies, even though they sometimes seem more like the remedial economies, but whether the so-called advanced economies are sort of doomed to have slower growth, say, for the next 20 or 30 years than we enjoyed certainly pre-recession for the post-World War II. And there are many, many articles that are being written about it in books. And let's see if I can get this to work. Here we go. And one of the people who's most respected and who's sort of leading the charge in this statement is Professor Robert Gordon from Northwestern University, who is saying something and going out on a limb and saying something that you can just imagine people will say, there was a time when Professor Gordon said, no more innovation, honey, get your jetpack on. We're gonna fly into outer space, and we'll make fun of him while we do that. And he actually knows what he's talking about, although I think he's failed to make his case. And but he and Professor Brynjolfsson from MIT actually are now going around the country at various events debating this topic because Brynjolfsson doesn't agree with him. But he enlists, here we say 6 headwinds. He's sort of retreated to 4 in his latest paper. And they are serious things to consider. One is demography, aging population, and whether or not you can still get rapid increases in productivity and whether you can therefore get rapid increases in growth with an aging population. The second is pretty serious charge, which is we've been neglecting education for so long in the United States that we're going to pay a price for it for many decades after. And that's a controversial statement. I'll get back to that at one of the last slides. Another point he makes is that we're continuing to still roll up enormous public debt. So we may be getting our private debt under control. There is no private debt at the corporate sector. There are huge surpluses. But we consumers have deleveraged since the end of the recession. And so we're getting some private debt under control. We may have defaulted on it, and some of it may have been nationalized and turned into federal debt. But that's going to be a headwind. And the last is he still believes that the period of rapid technological innovation has come to an end. Coming from Silicon Valley, I have to tell you that's a very strange notion, because we're working as fast as we can, just as we always have, to constantly take the technology that you're comfortable with and change it to give you something new to deal with. No sign that that's slowed down. Now, these other papers have these other books, this time is different, was a very influential book during the entire recession discussion, and pointing out that when you have a financial crisis, and we certainly did starting, it was evident by 2007 and quite evident in 2008, that when you have a financial panic that's associated with a recession, it's very hard to put Humpty Dumpty together again. You could be doomed to have disappointing growth for quite a while. Casey Mulligan's new book is arguing that our policies to fight the recession are actually stifling our chances of getting long-term growth, that we're giving people perverse incentives and making it hard for them to take the risks and go out, start a business, or introduce some new technology. And Tyler Cowen has actually been writing first in a similar vein, that we have the same way that Gordon wrote, but lately he actually sees a way out, and I think there's a slide that's got a picture of his new book. Well, so we have this problem that we seem to at least be stuck with lower growth than we would expect. We're not back to trend growth as calculated before the recession. Even if you say trend growth is going to be lower now, we're still not meeting most people's standards for that. And why is that? Well, weren't computers and smartphones and tablets supposed to make the economy more innovative and make it grow faster? We seem to be back exactly where we were in the late 80s. In the late 80s, Nobel laureate Robert Solow wrote, and he did this in several places, at least one was in the New York Times Book Review, and had this comment, which is you can see computers everywhere except in the productivity numbers. Looking back on that period, that's the period where people were playing solitaire at work. Okay? The question is, can you essentially take this new technology and make it productive? Didn't mean to do that. Let's go back here. Where is it? No, that's the wrong button to push. Try that again. All right, so that's Solow's claim, and the same claims are being made today. And they're being made by very serious statisticians and academicians who work for the government or are trying to understand the economy. They've even been fairly specific to Intel at times and said, Intel, you used to drive 0.5% of GDP growth by yourself every year. You don't do it anymore. And from the point of view of Intel, this seems insane because we're spending a fortune and working as hard as we can to have constantly new, improved processors, and our customers are able, they want to buy them, and they're able to sell them and convince people, with a caveat, which is the PC growth is slowing down. And it's, in fact, the PC unit growth is now diminishing. Fewer PCs were purchased last year than the year before, almost unheard of in the industry. But people are buying other technologies that use these inputs, tablets and smartphones in particular. So the question is, are we back in this world? When Solow wrote that, when he said that, everyone knew, he actually said further, he said it's embarrassing not to be able to see the growth that we're all so sure is there. Later on it showed up. In the second half of the 90s, there was very strong productivity growth. And it was usually claimed that it took that long for American companies to learn how to use the technology to become more productive. And the claim can be made, and has been made by Erik Brynjolfsson. I think the slide for the book where he makes that claim is a couple of slides from here, that in fact America is the fastest of all of the major economies in learning how to use new technology. The Europeans, the British are the fastest among the Europeans. The continental Europeans are kind of slow. The Japanese are hopelessly slow. The notion being, if you have work rules and traditions, if, for example, the tradition in your company is you don't get to make any decisions. Everything has to be checked with your superiors. You're not delegated any decision-making authority at all. Then what's the point of giving you access to the internet and the best analysis if no one is going to use your results? And so when that's happening, you don't expect to get productivity gains just because someone emulated an American company and decided to buy IT. And so that would be the question. One final thing let me say about this. I think there's a good argument to be made for the fact that productivity growth is actually faster than is being picked up in some of the stats. That's a kind of technical issue that's going to be has been discussed in Washington at several conferences and will continue to be. Now, as I said, that PC growth actually peaked, the PC sales actually peaked, and they've been going down. And what's been happening in this very innovative, rapidly changing industry, what's been happening is heads have been rolling. I could have filled this up, several pages of CEOs who lost their jobs or companies that decided that they better do something fundamentally different. Acer Computer Company, just a few years ago, was determined to be the biggest PC company in the world. They were charging hard on Hewlett-Packard to catch up to them. And they had aggressive pricing. They made very bold statements about how they were going to wipe everyone else out. And they were highly innovative in the newer PCs and the new designs. And then finally, they failed to keep up with the tablet phenomenon, and their CEO lost his job. So it's a big, big change for them. Nokia, once the king of the higher-end phones and the mid-level phones, sold its phone business to Microsoft, which is having its own problems. And then finally, the news just a few days ago, Sony's not going to do PCs anymore. So there are many other examples that include suppliers and that include, you could mention, for example, the restructuring of Dell, which is, you still have Michael Dell very much in charge, but he needed to restructure for the capital markets to be able to make this change. And then you can also mention the tragedy of Steve Jobs dying, leaving Apple, trying to still convince us that they still know the way to lead us in technology. Here are the only sort of sales figures I'll show you, and let me just point this out. First of all, these are in thousands, so we're talking about 1.4 billion units up here. And what I'm showing you here are the annual sales that are going on. And let me just point a few of these things out. This rocket, those are smartphones. When you think of smartphones, you probably think of your Samsung, or maybe you think of your iPhone. But these are smartphones. What's this that's dying? It's not PCs. It's phones that aren't so smart. It's what are called feature or entry-level phones. The world is rapidly moving to smartphones. It doesn't take as much additional logic, as much additional expense. Even people in countries that don't offer them good connectivity, so they can't actually surf on the internet on their phones, are actually marketing successfully very advanced phones. And this is partly a status symbol, but it's also partly an investment and a bet on the part of the people buying it that they're going to get access to those services, as well as the fact some of them are fairly privileged and they travel, and so they want them when they go to other countries. What else is going on here? Red is the notebook. The notebook has been king for so long. The prices for the components in notebooks this is not with revenue, this is just counts. And so a phone, especially if you buy a phone in the US, it might be free, it might be $199. You may have a service obligation. If you buy the same phone in Asia, it could be $600 or $800 because you don't take a service obligation. But it has some fairly inexpensive components in it. Notebooks have sort of top-line components. It's been a huge revenue workhorse for the industry. And now look what's happened. It peaked, and it's actually falling. Okay. Blue, desktops peaked a long time ago, just moving aside. We're just basically replacing our desktops. We're not growing them at all. This black is the tablet market, which is already bigger than either notebook or desktop. The phones ruin the scale, so I sort of ruined some of the dramatic growth of tablets. Okay. Here are servers chugging along here. Servers are the absolute primo things to be selling if you make silicon. The processors in servers are, people either buy dozens or hundreds of very low-end processors and put them in the servers, or they buy some very high-end processors, so it's been a big revenue story. But even server growth has started to disappoint people. Now, this is one of the ironies. I'm talking about a slowing economy. I'm talking about a rocket for smartphones, a rocket for tablets, and some traditional areas having some trouble. What's going on? Well, here's a contrast. There's this view that says what's going on is something absolutely mind-boggling. That forget that I was just talking to you about how the world is not buying as much of this technology. The world is buying so much of this technology. This technology is getting better at such an amazing rate that somewhere in the next 30, 40, 50 years, we may cross something that people have already named the singularity or the technological singularity. That is when computers are smarter than we are, and when they can build the next generation of computers to make them even smarter. Now, whether or not you buy into that, and by the way, John von Neumann talked about that a long time ago. It's goes in and out of fashion. You have to admit an awful lot of things have happened. We had IBM's Watson winning in Jeopardy, and we have the defending champion saying, I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords. Pretty funny. 15 years ago, you have IBM building big Deep Blue and winning and beating the best, probably the best chess player in the world. And consecutively now, constantly beating the best masters. So you have fantastic machines that can do things. This is a strange thing. The Google car, which actually my wife says she actually saw it. I envy her very much. She saw it on the freeway near San Jose. I assume there was a driver in it because they don't let it drive without a person in it because it will freak the other drivers out. But this is the Google. Now, just 10 years ago, there was a very solid engineering study talking about the problems that we're having with artificial intelligence and the things we can't get done. And it pointed out a paradox which has long been recognized. You can program a computer to do the most complicated math, but programming a robot to go pick up a glass and go to the sink and turn on the water to do something that a 3-year-old could do, maybe sloshing around the water a little, that we don't know how to do that. Well, in the last several years, we've learned how to program our robots and our computers to do the things that come very naturally and don't seem intellectually that demanding. That paradox is being resolved. Computers are learning to do those things too. And only 10 years ago, very good, convincing engineering study tried to demonstrate that we were not going to get self-driving cars. That was just not going to happen for many decades. And we pretty much have it already now. And then I just saw, in terms of the brave new world we're living in, these are artificial prosthetics, hands, for first a tragic but somewhat, it turns out, common mutation in which babies, in fact, are born without completely formed hands, and also for war victims, especially in the Congo, where, in fact, it turns out for a few $100s, you can make a beautiful prosthetic hand for, let's say, an adolescent or a young adult whose neck, and you can watch them catch a ball and throw it for the first time in their life. And Intel actually is setting up 3D printers in some parts of Africa so that people can learn to do some of this themselves. This is sort of the brave world. Whether we're at the singularity or not, we are riding a wave. You haven't seen anything yet about what's going to come, which is why it's hard to swallow Gordon's view that innovation is stopped. But there are a couple of things that I'll end with here. One is we're talking about, if you like, a consumer paradise in which your devices will do wonderful things for you, and they'll make your quality of life higher. I don't know about you. It's a bit of an apostasy for an Intel employee to say this, but I don't think I could live without my iPad. And it's how I listen to music in the morning. It's how I read the Financial Times in the morning. It's very, very important. And in the evening, I'm looking at my Kindle Fire, and that's where I'm reading the latest book that I want to read, whether it's a technical book or whether it's fiction. So I'm in a consumer paradise already, okay? But there's also this notion of technological unemployment. Economists have long criticized people who talk about technological unemployment and said they're basically anti-technology, they're Luddites. And we have to recognize that technological unemployment has been occurring in the small, probably ever since the Industrial Revolution started. You can definitely put people out of work with machines. But if your system is resilient enough, that doesn't apply in a widespread fashion, and people start acquiring the skills, and they do much better. But the question now is, is technology changing so fast that we're falling behind? And there is that claim. I didn't put it down here. I should have. Larry Summers gave a talk at NBER late last year where he took the notion very seriously that there's technological unemployment and suggested basically a research program to find out if that in fact is happening. I recount here a conversation I had with someone, with a CEO from a Middle East ICT firm, who said that in his country the kids are refusing to learn to use PCs. It's a developing, emerging market, that they're only going to use tablets and smartphones. And to me that's inherently contradictory. And I asked him, will you hire them when they're on the job market? He said no. I said, well, neither will Intel. The point is you can't be employable if all you know how to do is be a consumer using smartphones and tablets. You've got to be able to do something to be happy and to get gainful employment. What should you do? Well, Hal Varian, who's sort of a hero in information technology, the chief economist at Google, gave advice. Learn to do something that complements computers really well. And he said, in general, be indispensable as a complement to whatever it is that's really free and cheap. So be a complement to something relatively available, you'll have a job. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, Kasparov, who lost to Big Blue, continues to be very interested. And because of what happened with the best chess players in the world losing to computers, there's a new form of chess that's being played. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. Sometimes called advanced chess, sometimes called free-form chess. And here's how it's done. You get a bunch of people together, and you give them access to computers, and they play another team that has a bunch of people and has computers, and they see who wins. And here's what they've discovered. The best teams in the world are not made up of the best chess players in the world. They're made up of the best engineers in the world who know how to nudge the computers to coming up with the best solutions. They're following Hal Varian's advice without even knowing about his advice. They know how to work with computers. They can devastate a human player, and they can devastate even Deep Blue playing by itself. The combination of people and computers is a really potent combination. I recently have had the privilege to see a lot of what's going on in the medical research world with that, and you're just going to see some unbelievable things they'll be of the sort of the prosthetics from the 3D printers, but you're going to see amazing treatments for diseases with one caveat, and that's where I'll finish, which is, can our institutions keep up? So when you talk about all the changes in medicine that could occur, we have to let them occur. To let them occur, we have to be willing to take some risks. The precautionary principle says don't take risks on big things. Put the burden of proof on whoever wants to make the change that they're not going to accidentally do something awful to us. That's the precautionary principle. It's usually put on a slide so you can argue against it. I am no exception. It's not the world I want to live in which the precautionary principle stops us in our path. But there are risks, and they need to be recognized. There are going to be new cancer treatments that are going to be absolutely amazing if the FDA will let people do it. But they're not developed in the standard way. They could be a decade away, or they could be available to us very soon. And the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, actually does have provisions for fast-tracking dramatic breakthroughs, and so we're going to have to rely on whether our institutions can do that. In Wired for Innovation, Brynne Olson pointed out what I mentioned to you already, that your company has to be ready to use the technology. So I'm not trying to bash government. Can our private institutions keep up? I'm sort of trying to bash everyone. This is the challenge. Can we keep up? Can we sort of facilitate these changes? In that facilitate, don't regulate, the same thing happens in all human institutions. That we're scared of risks, and we want to vet everything, and we want to be wise, and we don't necessarily want to let wild, unpredictable things happen. That's what my industry is all about, doing wild, unpredictable things. So the question is, can these institutions keep up? Okay. And then the final thing I want to mention is the education issue. Because I mentioned at the beginning that Gordon lists what he sees as bad education since about 1970 as part of the obligation we have, part of the debt that we have that's going to make it hard for us to grow. I like Claudia Golden and Katz's book, The Race Between Education and Technology. Let me just sort of say, it's a tough book to read because it's an empirical tour de force. But their basic point is, in the US, as measured just by the number of years of education people had, not worrying about what's happening in the schools, we were always, very early in our national history, past the European countries, and continued having every decade you'd find that you had a better and better educated population. Around 1970, we stalled. Now you might think it's because we were as educated as the people needed to get, but the European and then the Asian countries came from below us, and they now have systematically more years of education than we do. In addition, the poor emerging countries have been increasing the amount of education. It's not at all anything close to what we have. There are benefits to what they're doing. They keep the kids sort of out of trouble. It's sort of babysitting. In the poorer countries and the poorer regions of the poorer countries, it may be the only square meal that the kids get each day. That's true in parts of India, in East India. But in the latest work by Lance Pritchett from Harvard, he's gone into poor schools around the world and he said there's no education going on. The kids are not learning to read. They're being socialized. They're learning what a wonderful person happens to be the president of their country and how he should be president for life. Or they're learning how they have the only true religion and other people do not. This is the challenge. As always, economists will say you don't just measure the inputs, measure the outputs. And so this is part of the challenge. Can we do something about this? If we can do something and get out of the way, let me remind you, you may have seen this scary statistic that almost half of Americans surveyed believe that the sun rotates around the earth instead of the earth around the sun. Now that's not because someone had an ideological program when they were teaching their kids. That's because something is going wrong in our educational system, if people think that. And it's not just kids, it's adults who think that. So that's our challenge. Can we get smarter so we can let the machines lead us to even a better and better outcome?
So I think we have, we've sort of run over a little bit, but I, for one, was very appreciative of the comments, and they were very important comments. I'm not terribly thrilled and optimistic based on both our presenters, especially the issue of, statistics are that we're not necessarily producing mid-wage and high-wage jobs in terms of the jobs that are being created. And if we can't rely on productivity to drive down the costs of consumer goods and things that we all want, cars and things like that, then how is that gap going to be met? I'm not quite sure. But let's turn over to audience questions if you have any. We'll have one or two questions. Anybody with a question?
What's the effect going to be for Brazil when they have the World Cup tournament? Because there'll be all those people there. They'll be spending money, and I would think it should be pretty good for them.
I know, that's interesting because we always get the question, we have a database on World Cups. Because everybody says, especially people that are production planners at Ford, they want to know, should I be looking to schedule more production because I'm going to take advantage? And it turns out that it really is a blip. So I really discount World Cups and Olympics quite a bit in terms of its ability to really stimulate on a sustained basis economic activity.
Can I just add one thing? It turns out that in other countries which have hosted the World Cup or the Olympics or Pan American Games and so on, there have been a lot of big screen TV sales. And again, it's probably bringing some of it forward. And one of the challenges for Brazil is they still have very high tariffs. And so a big screen TV is incredibly expensive in Brazil, so they may actually be choking off some of the stimulus they might otherwise get.
Okay, one more question? Anybody? Okay, well, hearing none, I want to thank our panel very, very much, and thank you. Good job. Now we will transition immediately into our panel on supply chain and international trade.